But Mike worked in some of the shelters that Garvin, well, not the exact shelter that Garvin's talking about, but he is the author of a book that won the Vancouver Book Prize from 2011. It's 2011's The Beggar's Garden, which is a collection of linked short stories about that often take place around the inner city in Vancouver. And Mike has also been a finalist, in addition to winning the Vancouver Book Prize for that book. He was a finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the BC Book Prize, and he was longlisted for the Giller Prize, which is a huge accomplishment for a first book. His second book, which is coming out in January 2015, is a novel called If I Fall, If I Die, and that's launching internationally. We can look out for that, certainly. But we were very, very privileged to have Mike commuting from Galliano, staying in his friend's backyard, and hanging out with us and with our vendors. So welcome, Mike.
No, I think I can do the juggling thing. So.
Do you want to try?
Okay, yeah, like a lectern.
Maybe a lectern.
Sure, yeah. Sorry, I'm going to apologize for my voice. I have some kind of Marlon Brando, Godfather kind of rasp to it. I don't know where it comes from, but you're going to have to bear with me and not be intimidated. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Jackie and Sean, for asking me to do this. I get asked to do not too many things, but some things, and I turn a lot of them down because I have 2 young children and I have a wife who I like very much, and I don't want to saddle her with the kids more than I sort of need to. So, but this was a no-brainer for me. Megaphone is an organization that I have just tremendous respect for, and the opportunity to teach, not teach, I'm going to accidentally say the word teach, but to be taught by Stefan and Peter and Garvin and Hendrik and Chris was a huge opportunity for me. I published this book in 2011, was it? Wow, it's been so long. And then I kind of, for other reasons, left Vancouver, so I didn't really get the chance to kind of read from it too much and to sort of engage with the community in the way that I wanted to at the time. So this is a great opportunity for me, so thank you for having me. So I'm going to read from this book. I do have a new book, and I could read from that, but I sort of feel like this book is more appropriate now. I wrote it after working and living in the downtown east side for 7 years. I was an advocate. I was a shelter worker. I told Garvin what to do, and I didn't actually, but and so I wrote it sort of in a response to that experience in my life. It's sort of both an ode to Vancouver and also a kind of piece of hate mail to Vancouver in a way. No, and I really wanted to do something, and that I think is what we're trying to do here, is to give a complex picture of a place. I think the downtown east side in particular is often maligned. It's called notorious, by the major news outlets without any kind of irony, and it's ridiculous. And I sort of wanted to do with fiction what is so great about fiction, is that it can, paint a more complex picture than just, it's a living hell where, people are languishing. It's that portray it as a vibrant community and portray Vancouver as a system kind of people. And so that's what I did. And so I'm going to read from a story that is completely invented, because I can't help but lie. And it's a story called Discard. It's probably like the most dear story to me in the book. And it's also a story very much about home. It's a story also about work, which is apropos, I think, for the evening, because these guys work so hard, selling Megaphone and being such a part of the community. And I think that's something that should be recognized and celebrated. So it's a story about an elderly man named Earl, and he is recently widowed. His wife, whose name is Thule, has recently sort of has had an aneurysm and died. And he's retired and he's living in his house and he's not taking care of himself. And then one night he's watching television and he sees a special on homelessness on TV on the CBC, and he recognizes his grandson on the program who's lining up at a soup kitchen. And so Earl decides, and they're long estranged. At one time Earl cared for him, and he decides that he's going to go to Vancouver and reconnect with his grandson. So I'm going to pick it up when he arrives in Vancouver. When he arrived at the airport in Vancouver, he took a taxi and sat up front, making a point of shaking the driver's hand before paying him, leaving no tip. He rented a room in an outlying motel with weekly rates and purchased the silver hatchback with a portion of the money he'd received for the house. The city was not new to him. As a young man, he'd hitchhiked out west and worked loading grain ships for a summer. He passed most of that time in the murk of beer parlors and the arms of deceitful women. It was a period of his life he cared not to revisit, part of a span of lost years he couldn't fully conjure in his head if he tried. Tully had never pressed him about it, another of her many kindnesses, and for this he was grateful. He drove downtown, found the soup kitchen from the news report with no trouble, and parked across the street each day for a week, long enough for the prostitutes and drug dealers to give up on approaching his car. Earl had never seen people so wretched. It was as if the country had been tipped up at one end and all of its sorry bastards had slid west, stopping only when they reached the sea, perhaps because the sea didn't want them either. Why a man would choose to live in this desperate, brutal way rather than in a house with a family, Earl could not fathom. Was it so hard? There had been plenty of jobs when he'd come in his youth. You could have your pick. But even then, there were those who'd rather take what another had built than build it themselves. So perhaps the place really had changed, only managed to attract more of them. Then one drizzly Thursday evening, a red-bearded man took his place in line. His hockey jersey bore the number of a player the Canucks had traded south well over 10 years ago. The sleeves, once home team white, were now mottled brown and gray. It was Kyle. There was no doubt. He waited his turn and went inside, soon emerging with a paper bowl of something steaming he blew on as he set off down the street. Earl put his car in gear. He followed the boy for some time with no purpose in his mind that he could have honestly described if he were stopped and asked. He never actually considered what he'd do once he found him, and now that it had proven so easy, he was beginning to suspect he'd made a terrible mistake. Stopping a man he didn't know from Adam to offer advice on how to live his life seemed futile, silly even, as well as potentially dangerous. Earl gasped for a block or so, then pulled over to allow Kyle to walk ahead. He knew his grandson could pick out detail only up to a distance of about 10 feet, and that's what the doctors had said anyway. He has an eye disability. That's what the doctors had said anyway, so he trailed closer than he would have anyone else. Kyle walked briskly, his free arms swinging. He looked more robust than he had in the news special. A man tracking his own grandson like an elk, Earl thought, shaking his head at what he'd been reduced to. After about 10 blocks, Kyle stopped at the edge of a mall, a small vacant parking lot, and disappeared into a row of large bushes beneath a billboard that flipped back and forth between two pictures like a set of vertical blinds. Earl pulled over. He waited, tapping at the wheel with his thumbs. He failed to imagine what would make his grandson want to live in all this filth and confusion. Vancouver had always seemed more like an encampment than a city to Earl, about as permanent as a card table set up for a Friday night game. Perhaps it was drugs, but the boy looked all right, physically that is, healthy even. What Earl knew of drugs were the sniveling junkies of television forensics shows. A sudden honking made Earl jump, and he saw his rear view full with a hulking shape uptight to his bumper. He stuck his arm out and waved the bus around. It only honked again and lurched closer. As Earl pulled away, he saw his grandson emerge from the bushes with the loaded shopping cart he must have stashed there. Earl made a right and had to go a few blocks south because of one-ways, and when he returned to the lot, his grandson was gone. He applied sudden force to the small wheel, ceasing only when he feared it would break off. He spent the next 3 hours crisscrossing the neighborhood and swearing under his breath until he finally spotted him, now without his shopping cart, outside a dingy building called the Grandview Hotel. The tired neon of the hotel's sign was familiar to Earl, and he had a feeling he'd spent some time drunk in a room there, perhaps a long time, but he pushed it from his mind. He watched Kyle pull a key from his trousers, unlock a door, and step in. The next morning, Earl parked out front of the Grandview Hotel for the whole day, plugging the meter, cluttering his dashboard with the wrappers of hot dogs bought from a street vendor. There was no sign of Kyle. He returned to his motel that night and got drunk on the wine coolers he'd bought because he'd not been in a liquor store in 20 years, not even when Thule died, and had thought the festive bottles were a new kind of beer. Something about the distance from home, or the fact that he no longer had one, or that he no longer had someone to explain himself to, made drunkenness more reasonable to him than it had been in years. The next day he was parked in the same spot, even earlier than the previous, watching the weak sun climb into the mountains to the east like the first leg of a roller coaster. He bought a road map and a mechanical pencil at a drugstore, and now he unfolded the map, located the Grandview Hotel, and made a star with his pencil. At exactly 7, Kyle appeared, and Earl followed him, quickly sketching his route on the map when he stopped to let Kyle walk ahead. Earl followed him all day and the next. After a week of this, he had learned that his grandson made exactly the same journey at the same time each day, 7 days a week, taking on average 8 hours to push his roaring cart up alleys and over bridges through a circuit of dumpsters, mostly for condos and apartment buildings that traversed a good part of the city and ended at a series of second-hand stores and street vendors where he attempted to sell what he'd found. By the end, Earl had produced a meticulous map, and it delighted him that he was able to pinpoint the boy at any time of day. But even after Earl completed the map, he continued to follow his grandson for no reason other than he liked to watch Kyle work, because work was the only way to describe what he was doing, whether he was getting paid for it or not. After much frustrated flipping through the manual, Earl had mastered his car's trip odometer, and he clocked Kyle in at about 20 kilometers a day, which impressed him. At times, Earl felt like the support car for one of those disabled people who wheelchaired across the country for charity. He watched his grandson tether impossibly large objects to the rickety cart and push them great distances to the places they could be sold or stashed for later. The boy's labor seemed to belong to another time. Earl thought of pharaohs' forced marches, treks across the deadened earth in search of new beginnings. He found himself strangely proud of his grandson, proud of the steady way he carted the things he found and of the resourcefulness the task required. Earl knew that he himself had never worked so hard in his life. The first thing Earl left was a rain poncho. It had kept him dry for years atop hydro poles, but he had no use for it now, clocking most of his time in his car. He left it poking from a grocery bag beside one of the dumpsters, and the next rainy day he was pleased to see Kyle wrapped in it. He remembered Easter egg hunts, hiding foiled eggs in the garden and tool shed for Kyle to find, ruddy joy in the kid's face as he tore around the yard like a crazed detective. Now Earl leaves cheap sneakers and chickens, cases of sports drinks, tarps, and packages of size medium underwear, and it pleases him to think that Kyle values these items that appear magically each evening in his dumpsters. Earl likes to think that his grandson feels he is, in some small way, lucky. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was beautiful. I'm so glad that you chose Discard too. That's also my favorite story in that book. And I just, there's other parts of that story which describe the alleyways of the West End, and that's a neighborhood where I used to live too. And I just totally, it's so resonant and beautiful. So thank you so much for sharing this with us and for being here today, making the trek across the water again.